more than 50% of the US population is against sending more aid to Ukraine. That polling percentage goes even higher if you don't include tracking or auditing the money or weapons being sent to Ukraine. Does Washington, D.C. regularly ignore the will of the American people
Oh, absolutely.
of the will of the top people in Washington, D.C.?
Absolutely. I would argue that, in most cases, no one in Washington pays attention unless they somehow or another are at risk. I mean, you'll recall when Obama was president, he was prepared to launch a really major air campaign into Syria. And when people got word of this through various mainstream media outlets, the phones rang off the hook. Members of Congress were deluged effectively with letters and statements and pleas for, we don't want to be in another war. We don't like where we are now. We want to get out. Forget it. And so he came to the podium planning to do this, and then suddenly said, nope, I'm not going to do this, and walked away. So the American people can have an impact. The problem is, I'm surprised as many as you cited are opposed to sending more aid because they've been treated to nothing but lies in the press. I mean, literally lies that are spun out as narratives by the intelligence agencies, primarily the CIA and MI6 in London. And everyone has essentially sung from the same sheet music all over Western Europe and the United States and in the English-speaking world.
Yeah. The propaganda is out of control, and I want to talk about that a little bit more. But do you think that there's any real damage that will be done to Ukraine by not passing more aid this last round in Congress? Because I'm reading this morning that President Biden had to jump on an emergency phone call with Germany, the United Kingdom, Japan, Italy, Poland, to assure the leaders of those nations that the United States is still in this war, they're still supporting Ukraine, and that, yes, more American tax dollars will make their way to Ukraine, so don't give up on this war.
Well, I'm not really surprised, and I think it's important for your listeners to understand that none of this would be happening were it not for Washington. In other words, if Washington did not want this conflict to erupt, it would never have erupted. All they had to do was listen to what the Russians were telling us, which is, we won't accept Ukrainian membership in NATO. End of discussion. It's off the table. And that if you press this, we will defend ourselves. And of course, for 8 years, we built this Ukrainian army into a fairly formidable instrument with the goal of attacking Russia, the two so-called breakaway provinces in the east, and then ultimately to regain control of the Crimea. So I think they finally said, no one's listening to us. You'll recall that several proposals were tabled before all of this began on the 22nd of February, and nothing happened. So that needs to be understood. If Washington said tomorrow morning, ladies and gentlemen of NATO, we've had it. We're not going to underwrite this any longer. We're stopping our aid, then they would too. There's no question about that. And that would make it impossible for the Zelensky regime to continue its operations. And of course, that would send an unambiguous signal to the Russians that, number one, we're not going to intervene militarily in this, and we're not going to support this regime anymore, which means that the regime will have to negotiate. And the Russians have not really altered their conditions for the end of this business. What they've always said is, first of all, Ukraine, now whatever remains of it, must be neutral. And there's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. Now, they also want a representative inside the Ukrainian government, someone who sits on the Ukrainian equivalent of the National Security Council, who is there essentially to watch out for Russian national security interests, to make sure that under no circumstances will Ukraine become again what it is now, which is a deadly threat to Russia. And then finally, they're going to demand territorial concessions. I think they still want Kharkov. I assume Odessa. Whether or not there's a willingness to talk about that is unclear to me. But certainly all of the territory that they currently hold in Kharkov will have to return to Russian hands. And note, I say return because those areas have always been Russian, full of Russians. filled with Russian speakers. Never permanently part of Ukraine or this entity, this regional state we call Ukraine. Absolutely not. So that's where we are. And I think Biden and his friends were shocked that there was that much opposition to sending more aid. I mean, thus far, what has Congress done on any number of issues? Border, immigration, the war in Ukraine, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, 2,000 income transfer programs we call welfare. What have they always done? Nothing. Nothing. And that's why we called a uniparty. It was interesting to listen earlier today to some Republicans talk about the border and act as though they were so upset and concerned about it. Well, where were they 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 10 years ago? Yeah, it's a lot of nonsense. I think the American people will come around to figuring all of this out, but I think it's going to take some more pain, which I think is coming. You know, we're on the pain train when it comes to the financial system and the economy. No question. It's only a question of when does the engine seize up, and everybody then says, "Oh, we got to get off."
Yeah, well, I think with all of the illegal immigrants going into Chicago and New York City specifically, it seems like a lot of Democrat voters have had their eyes open for the first time, where maybe Republicans down in Arizona and Texas and California have been complaining until it's gotten further north and threatened their welfare systems and their neighborhoods and their tax dollars. It hasn't really become real. Going back to something you said, you said that Biden could end this, but he very clearly said in his United Nations address that Vladimir Putin alone has the power to end this war tomorrow. But that's not true. So why would he say things like that? Is he hoping the American people aren't listening or that we're stupid?
Well, he's trying to maintain the fiction that Russia is something that it is not. He keeps sort of depicting President Putin and his government as some sort of authoritarian, anti-Western, anti-democratic regime. That's not really true. This Russia has nothing in common with the Soviet Union. It has a little bit in common with Tsarist Russia. They have a stronger central authority because historically, the largest country in the world, Russia, has needed that strong central authority to survive. But otherwise, it is by no means the sort of satanic entity that the Biden administration and its supporters claim. Far from it. In fact, if you were going to make that argument, you have to turn to Ukraine, where you can find plenty of evidence for that sort of satanic character. The Russians have acted very defensively throughout this entire thing. You recall when they went in, they only went in initially with 90,000 troops. Then they began increasing those numbers as it became clear that no one would negotiate with them. When it was finally obvious that any further negotiation was impossible after Boris Johnson showed up in Kiev and told everybody on behalf of Biden, we're going to support you as long as it takes, no matter what. Then the Russians said, well, this is not going to work. And so the small army that everyone was claiming was incapable suddenly went on to the defensive. And that started in the fall. They're up to almost 1 million men under arms now. The army has transformed. They're better equipped than they've ever been. This is a much more lethal force than anything Russia fielded in the 1980s. And lately, you've had some very stark warnings come out of Moscow. One of the more popular and famous figures in the Duma, who is very close to President Putin, said just within the last few days, this is the situation. Ukraine can accept our demands, meet our demands, or it can cease to exist. Wow. And he's very close to President Putin. Yeah. I think that's the mood. I think people have had it with it because their great nightmare is you sit down with the West, you negotiate another settlement, you ask for neutrality, they promise you neutrality, and instead they give the place cancer, which is essentially what we did in the coup in 2014. We gave the place terminal cancer. So that means that the Russians will probably press on in the weeks ahead all the way to the river. I'd be very surprised if they didn't. They're in a position where they can move up and seize Kharkov almost immediately. And the Ukrainians have evacuated large numbers of people from Kharkov with that expectation in mind. They've also evacuated a number of people from Kherson and parts of Odessa. It may be that the Russians will cross the river while the river is very low, move over into Western Ukraine and down into Odessa. I don't know. They have the capability to do this. Remember, Putin has been reluctant to do it for three reasons. Number one, he didn't want to provoke intervention from the West because he doesn't want to go to war with us. I mean, imagine that. What a novel idea. I wish people in Washington shared that view. Secondly, he didn't want to take heavy casualties. He decided, let's wear out these Ukrainians first, and that's where they are now, completely worn out. But I don't think he or his generals ever thought that the Ukrainian forces would hurl themselves relentlessly into these defenses, which they had absolutely no chance whatsoever of cracking. I think they're amazed. And right now, if your viewers have paid any attention, you got to look for it, but you can find it. There are mass desertions. Mass surrenders are occurring up and down the line. Ukrainian soldiers are tired. They're exhausted. They've been shot to pieces. The people that are out there now are probably the least trained soldiers that Ukraine has ever fielded. These are effectively civilians who a few weeks ago were conductors on trolleys, driving buses, teaching school, cleaning streets. Welcome to the Ukrainian army, and off you go to the meat grinder. These people don't want to die, and I think they've had it. The other thing is that the Russians have been very smart. They haven't mistreated the Ukrainians. They know if they surrender, they come up on a frequency if they can, and they all speak Russian. And they say, look, we want to come over. We can't evacuate our wounded. No one will help us. And the Russians say, sure, come over. And they move them through a process. They're fed, they're cared for. And then at the earliest opportunity, I'm sure they'll be repatriated. The other thing is that Ukrainian soldiers know that they're battalion commanders. These are lieutenant colonels. Probably many of the company commanders, certainly everyone above lieutenant colonel, is essentially cheating them out of their salaries. Whereas we're paying the Ukrainian army's salary. Let's face it. We've got Ukraine is the 51st state. And they know that these commanders are carrying people on the rolls who have been dead for months, killed in action. Well, why are they doing that? Because money to pay them keeps showing up. And so these officers are pocketing the cash. Now, what happens to the widows, the orphans? Well, they're getting nothing. I mean, this is a vicious circle of corruption that in wartime is probably even worse than it was before this thing started. So Ukraine is a completely dysfunctional state. If you're looking for an example of a failed state, this is it. And we're keeping the failed state safe on life support. Ukraine is a failed state on life support. That's about it. But that's also for theater here. Remember George Kennan, and many of your viewers will remember that name. He was a brilliant man, and he shaped in many ways our thinking about foreign policy, certainly at the outset of the Cold War. He warned against the folly of helping Stalin. He told everyone that was insanity. We'd pay a terrible price for it. No one listened. Finally, after Roosevelt died and Truman met with Stalin, he figured out that Kennan was right. And Kennan accurately assessed and analyzed the Soviet Union. He also made it clear that the way to defeat the Soviets was not in a head-on attack. It was to contain them. Now, he didn't say contain communism everywhere because he knew communism everywhere wasn't the same. But he knew that containing Russian communism, the Soviet Union, was important. And of course, it worked. It fell apart. And he was still alive when his prognostications finally came true. But Kennan used to complain that we do things in foreign policy really to make ourselves feel good about ourselves. We don't do things for rational reasons. Rationality would have dictated an end to this terrible conflict months ago. So why does it go on? Well, you've got a lot of people that can't retreat from bad policy stances. We'll support you till the bitter end. Well, why? Why? Is Russia our enemy? Oh, yeah, Russia's our enemy. Really? What have they done to us lately? Oh, well, they're always bad. This is the sort of blatant stupidity that has been easy to sell in the United States because in the world I grew up in, Russia was the enemy. The Soviet spies always spoke with a Russian accent. We knew who the enemy was. That all went away in 1992. Russia is a great power. Russia has much more in common with Tsarist Russia than it did with the Soviet Union, and Tsarist Russia was not an evil place. So this is all nonsense that needs to go away. Unfortunately, it's deeply rooted, and the politicians won't abandon it, because if they abandon it, they might be held accountable. Now, I think the accountability issue is probably more likely to occur in Europe before it happens here. We've already begun to see that. We had these elections in Slovakia. We now have a prime minister in Slovakia who is dead set against this Ukraine war, wants to end it. He is the tip of a very large iceberg. And I think in Germany, France, and many other countries, we're going to see turnovers in government. Now, I'm not saying that one turnover and everything comes up roses, but I think we're in for a long, bumpy ride in Europe, and I think we're going to start one here as well, because all the proverbial chickens are coming home to roost.
Yeah.
All the things we've ignored, all the mistakes we've made, everything, it seems to be coming together in a kind of perfect storm.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. Poland's having a change of heart. Slovakia has this new person in charge. Germany and France, they're unhappy. America's unhappy. We could have another Trump time. We could have an RFK. Lots could change. I don't know if you saw this or not. It took thinking about it for a minute to sink in, but on the one hand, you and I see that Russia's growing, that they're building this army, they're pumping out ammunition and weapons 24 hours a day. But then over in Ukraine, they're saying, listen, with only 5% of your defense budget, we've done more with your money than the US military could do. That's how good we are. We've taken out half of the Russian army with 5% of your budget. I mean, isn't that insulting and a lie at the same time?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's completely ludicrous. You depend upon who you talk to. And this is tough because obviously people are not revealing the truth in the West about much of anything. But I talked about 400,000 dead. Now my sources and my colleagues are telling me, Doug, it's up to 450,000 or more. The situation is that grim. They tell me now about 60 to 70,000 amputees. How many hundreds of thousands of casualties beyond that exist, we don't know. But when you see an army that begins to melt away, which is what's happening right now in eastern Ukraine, it's pretty obvious that this war is lost. There's no question about it. The war is lost. Any reasonable man would come to this conclusion and say, we have to sue for peace. If we don't sue for peace, we'll go under. But you remember this regime and its sponsors in the West, what I call the Western rich oligarchs that really control things behind the scenes in Washington and London and elsewhere. They want this to go on, and it doesn't matter to them what really happens to the Ukrainian nation. It's very obvious to me that Zelensky doesn't, because if he did, he would have stopped this a long time ago. You're killing the seed corn of future generations in Ukraine. And now they want us to round up Ukrainian men who have fled to the West and send them back so that they too can take their place among the dead. No, this is insanity. And Americans would never do this. They would have intervened and said, this is wrong. We've got to stop. We're not that bad. We do have some humanity left in us, but it's not in Washington.
Yeah. The head of NATO said that they will continue to support Ukraine and that Ukraine's future is definitely in NATO. Is there any truth to this, or is this a giant dangling carrot to keep Ukraine fighting?
First of all, I don't think the Ukrainians are interested in dying anymore. I think it's going to be tougher and tougher to keep them in the fight, so to say. They already have a very powerful force with the SBU, the Ukrainian Secret Police, and they do execute people, and they do imprison people and torture people, and they are going to do everything in their power to keep these Ukrainians in line. They keep the squads of Ukrainians small. They don't allow groups of more than 3 or 4 Ukrainian men to get together. If you have a platoon and a company all at once marching into the front line, there's always the danger of a rebellion. They don't want a rebellion. So they feed in new troops in small numbers. So is this going to keep them into the war? And that's why we say it. No, I think we say it, and we will continue to say it, because people just don't want to be exposed. They've been pushing very bad policy with terrible consequences for us, for Europe, for Ukraine. And it's failing. And what do you do when you have no choice and everything is failing? If the truth is ugly, a lie is beautiful. You know, how many people were standing on the outskirts of Berlin, you know, sort of demented Nazis who thought, gee, we're still going to win the war, until the Soviets finally entered East Berlin and we came in from the West. There were people like that. You know, that movie Downfall is very instructive, because in the movie, towards the end, when Hitler goes in to shoot himself, as he turns to open the door and go in and commit suicide, one of the women standing in the hallway who was working in the bunker says, "But mein Führer, what about the inevitable victory?" I mean, this is, you have a combination of ideologues who are deceitful and dishonest. And on the other hand, you've got a lot of people who want to believe something and they can't quite wrap their minds around the truth that what they've been told is a lie.
Yeah.
I think the American people fall into that category.
Yeah. Do you think the CIA is accurately assessing the strength of Russia and their growing army and then lying about it in the presidential briefing? Or do you think that they really believe that Russia is weak and easily toppled? Like, I'm trying to get like beyond the propaganda and the paranoia.
Well, at lower levels, there are always analysts who do an excellent job, whether it's the CIA or DIA or NSA or anywhere else. I've seen this. And they put the analysis together and then they bring it to the next level, to probably to a lieutenant colonel. He says, "I don't know about this." "Well, what's wrong with that, sir?" "Well, I don't think the boss is going to like this." He said, "Let's run it by the director first before we go see the general." The director says, "Oh my God, I can't put this in front of the general. He'll go berserk." "Well, why?" "Because the people above the general, the appointed political officials, they don't want to hear that." And so this sort of thing goes on year after year after year. I was once worked briefly in the Office of Net Assessment back in 1986 in the summer. The Office of Net Assessment is a place where large-scale assessments of opposing forces are developed, or at least at that point where simulations are run, models were employed in order to do exactly what you said, to try and get a clear picture. And while I was there, I was asked to look over this assessment, and I was at the time working on my doctoral dissertation. And I said, well, from all the information I can see right now, of the non-Soviet forces in the Warsaw Pact, the only ones that might be reliable in the event of a collision with the United States are the East Germans. The Poles, the Czechs, the Hungarians, they're not really interested in fighting, and they'll probably not fight, or at least try not to fight if there's a war. Well, I was thanked for my interest in national defense. And there was none of that in the final analysis. No, that's not what we want to say. We were talking about justifying budgets, massive outlays for defense, for all sorts of equipment. But in truth, this thing called the Soviet mastodon, the great power of the world, was already on the skids. There were many people who recognized that. The question that everybody wanted to answer is, well, when does it fall apart? It's sort of like the proverbial black swan in economics and finance. People say, well, all right, I agree with you. The 10-year Treasury interest rates are rising. This is very dangerous. This means that all of the old treasuries that were bought years ago at very low interest rates are now liabilities, so-called unrealized losses. What are we going to do about those? Well, eventually got to get rid of them. They're worth nothing now. Well, how do you do that? Well, this is a difficult situation that we're now in. There are lots of banks in the United States confronting this problem. It's a problem overseas and around the world. It's the same thing. Well, did anybody step forward and say, this might not be a good idea. We might want to sell these off now and shift our interest bearing money into other markets and other things? I'm sure they did, but it wasn't welcome news. There's a book by John Kenneth Galbraith. So he talks about financial crises, history of financial crises. He says this, you have people at the top who are not there because they've demonstrated remarkable character. They're there because they went along. And they're fine until there's a real crisis.
Yeah.
And then they all have to go away because they can't cope. We see that in the banking system. We see it in finance. We see it in the military. We see it in politics. I think that's where we're headed right now. I can't predict which day, which week, but I think things are going to get pretty dicey here.
Yeah.
And I think Americans sense it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think they're feeling it. Like you say, the pain train is on the move, and they're starting to feel it in different areas, whether it's, hey, who are all these people showing up? Or, man, I can't afford the groceries that I used to. Or, great, now interest rates are above 5%. I've got no money to earn any interest on.
Well, it's very interesting when you look at something like illegal immigration. People are now becoming, finally, after all these years, much more sensitive to it than I can remember for 2 decades. And the official number of illegals inside the United States, it's the consensus number. That's what people tell you in the mainstream media is, well, there's 7 million, maybe 8. Well, that's all nonsense. All you have to do is cloister yourself privately with people in Homeland Security, talk to people down the Border Patrol, talk to people in Washington who are involved on the periphery of these things. They'll tell you, well, there are probably 28 million in here. But do we really know? It may be more. The truth is, we don't know. But you throw out a number like that, and everybody's, oh, well, that's outrageous. That can't possibly be. Well, I've got news for you. There's a reason the mayors of, as you pointed out, in Chicago and New York City are saying, I need tens of millions of dollars to house all of these so-called migrants. Americans are also saying, well, while you're trying to do that, where are you going to put them to work? Who's going to employ these people? And if we were to have a significant recession or even depression, then matters are much worse because we've taken on this additional responsibility that we can't handle. And Americans are not going to be favorably disposed to the government that is spending enormous sums of money on people who are not citizens. So this is not a good thing. People say, well, they're not a big burden. Well, we have 27 million people roughly that we think are without health insurance. Maybe it's more. I don't know. How many people coming into the country have health insurance? Well, we know the answer to that question. Well, then how do they get help if they need it? Well, they go to emergency rooms. And we don't turn people away. We have to treat them. But that's not cost-free. And those are the complaints that you're hearing now from the states, from cities. It's all finding its way back to Washington. But this is the sort of worst kind of irrational management. It's emotive. It's not founded on any logic that makes any sense. And that's the same thing with the Ukraine war. This was all an emotional response by the committed ideologues that hate Russia because it's an Orthodox Christian state with a Russian national identity that doesn't want to open its borders to anyone and allow anyone in. Well, that's why they hate Hungary. That's why the Poles are currently, receiving heat, and the Slovaks and others. These are societies where people have said, well, look at Germany. What a catastrophe. Look at Sweden. The Swedish prime minister is talking about using the army to try and regain control of Stockholm and other cities from the so-called, migrants or refugees that have been invited in. Well, this is a catastrophe. The rule of law is breaking down. And when that breaks down, your civilization is in severe trouble. I think that's where we are. And I think Putin is watching this from a distance. He and his advisors, I think they know that. Perhaps they're waiting for things to get worse before they finally move. I don't know. But at some point, they're going to have to come to the conclusion, I suspect, that no one is going to show up and negotiate much of anything, in which case they'll have to decide the issue the way they'd rather not, with military power.
Yeah. Yeah. Couple more questions, and I'll let you move on with your day.
I'm sorry for ranting and raving today. I'm a little depressed by where we're headed.
Hey, I feel it every day. My wife's like, "How do you read this every day and not get depressed?" I was like, "Well, I just, you see that corner right there? That I'll just go suck my thumb in that corner for a minute." But okay, bringing coming back home to the United States. I know the military tries to stay apolitical because at any given time they could have a commander in chief that's a Democrat or a Republican. Do you think General Milley's swipe at Trump, calling him a wannabe dictator, do you think that was political or personal?
General Milley is probably, if not the, then certainly one of the most politicized figures in uniform I've seen in a long time. Of course, that's also true for Petraeus and most of the senior officers. The senior ranks in this country have always been somewhat politicized. FDR was very unhappy with the Army and the Army Air Corps. And one of the reasons he's very unhappy dealing with it was that he knew all the generals were Republicans. They were anti-New Dealers. And he was really pleasantly surprised when he discovered that an opposing Republican named George Marshall actually was fiercely loyal to the state and to him. And I think that we were that way despite our political preferences and affiliations for a long time. That began to break down in Vietnam. I think it really broke down dramatically with LBJ. If you look at Johnson, every time he tries to make a pronouncement about the war in Vietnam, he drags in a four-star, General Earl Wheeler, Chief of Staff of the Army, then subsequently Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, or General Westmoreland. These people show up with all these ribbons on their uniforms, some of which are meaningful, but most of which are not. But people don't know that. A lot of those are thank you for coming medals, or as my friends in the Marines start pointing and say, oh, it's cruise number 2 to the Pacific, cruise number 3, and so forth. But people love these brass buttons and medals, and they see these generals, and the general smiles and says, "Yes, I'm confident that we can achieve our aims within the time frame given, provided we have the resources we've asked for. Thank you, Mr. President." I mean, how many times do you hear that stuff? Well, they have no business being there. They shouldn't have been there. LBJ was leaning on these people. And just about everybody since LBJ has repeated this over and over and over again. I was disappointed when President Trump did it. Don't drag these military men into anything. First of all, stop pretending that these are great men. None of them are George Patton or Eisenhower or MacArthur or anything else. They haven't done anything. Most of them never heard a shot fired in anger. Who are we kidding? So if you want to pay tribute to the real heroes of the last 20 years, go to Arlington. They're laid out there for you. Or look at all these poor people that you see from Wounded Warrior and other programs that have been terribly injured as a result. Those are the heroic figures that stayed the course. But Americans don't really understand these kinds of things. And I hope in the future, if he gets back into office, or it doesn't matter to me, whoever ultimately wins needs to put an end to this business of leaning for political support on generals and admirals. Forget it. It's wrong. When Marshall came over to testify, not all the time, but most of the time, he wore civilian clothes. And that was habitual. When General MacArthur was chief of staff, he showed up to testify in civilian clothes. They wore suits. You know why? Because there was a feeling that if they came over in uniform with all their accoutrements and belts and everything else, that this would be intimidating to members, many of whom had never served. We thought that was bad form. So you had to come over there in a suit and make your case. That meant that you were very reliant on your own intelligence and ability to articulate the case on behalf of the United States Army or Navy. We've lost that. We now have a show every time something else. You see the State of the Union, or all my chiefs of staff there, lined up. This has got to stop. We are not a militarized country. This is not a everybody says fascism, and Trump has got less in common with fascism than almost anybody I can think. He's a grandfather. If I were to criticize President Trump for anything based upon the time I saw him, say he's too damn nice and should have fired large numbers of people instantly. And add to that the numbers of people he picked that were his enemies that actively subverted him. And I would say, again, I would go back to Eisenhower, who gave excellent advice to President Kennedy when he took over. JFK said to him, General, because he gave him back his rank after he was president as General of the Army, he said, General, do you have any last bits of advice for me? And frankly, at that point, Eisenhower didn't think much of Kennedy. But he said, yes, I do. And he said, what's that? He said, be a good butcher. And JFK looked at him and said, well, what do you mean? He said, look, you're going to have to fire people if you expect anything to get done. Says people don't do what you tell them to do. When they don't, you got to get rid of them. People have to be held accountable. If they're not loyal, if they talk to the press, if they undermine you, get rid of them. End of discussion. That's how it has to be. Well, JFK didn't do that. And then he went through something called the Bay of Pigs. What a wonderful title. And he discovered just how many pigs he had. And then he began to take action. This is the lesson of history. Everybody talks about civilian control of the military. Well, it's not just civilian control, it's the control of anything, which is to impose accountability. If there's no accountability, there's no performance. Real quick, go back to our withdrawal from Afghanistan. Was President Biden the responsible agent? No. He gave an order. He said, I want you to get out. Well, then who's responsible? Was it General Milley? Well, General Milley is his senior military advisor and should have warned him after he looked at the plans that he didn't think the plans were very good. And perhaps before we left, we needed to change the plans. But as far as I know, he did no such thing. So his utility to the president as the senior advisor was nil, nothing. So that takes you to General McKenzie, who was the commander of U.S. Central Command, the 4-star Marine. He was responsible. He was the man whose staff planned everything. He picked the commanders, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, Marine commanders, Army commanders, Air Force. Those people were picked. He was the man that formulated the plans. He's the man who was responsible for the debacle. What's happened to him?
Probably a raise or a promotion.
No, he retired. He's on the talk circuit, and I'm sure he'll be given a comfy job in the defense industry or somewhere else so that he can persuade his colleagues on active duty to invest in things that they probably don't need. That's another story. That's a huge problem in Washington, D.C. But the point is, you've got to hold people accountable. If they get it wrong, you get rid of them. And sometimes we found in the past, when Pershing was in command during World War I, Pershing removed or relieved large numbers of general officers. And in fact, he sent them, when he relieved them, to a town in France called Cannes. You've heard of Cannes, where the film festival is? That's where the expression comes from. He got canned. In other words, he was fired. They canned him. The general canned him, sent him to Cannes. So he appointed another general that he knew was a classmate and said, I want you to go there, interview all these people, and tell me if I made a mistake. And out of the 40 or 50 that he interviewed, this general went through and investigated. There were 2 that he came back and he said, these 2 men shouldn't have been relieved. So he said, thank you very much, and reinstated them. The others went away. You've got to do it, even though there's always the potential for a mistake. But you've got to hold people accountable. And there is no accountability in Washington for anything. You started this entire interview with a question. Does anybody in Washington pay attention to the American people? Well, only if they think it's going to help them. If they think by subsidizing something in their district or getting somebody a job who is in their district, or their senators from a state and bring a new defense industry into the state, that's their view of what they're doing to help their friends. But remember, they're helping themselves whenever they do it. There's no such thing as altruistic behavior in Washington. Nobody does anything for nothing. Nobody does anything because they believe in it. I hate to be blunt, but that's been my experience.